It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ASUS PA32DC. The OSD is controlled by pressable buttons, a nice number of them, towards the bottom right of the monitor on the bottom bezel. The thing there is not actually a button, that's a proximity sensor, and I'll go through that shortly with the associated feature in the OSD. There's then a power button accompanying power LED. You can turn that off if you prefer. It glows white when the monitor's on, and amber when it enters a low power state. You can turn it off in the OSD if you prefer. The ones with little blobs on them, so it's got little sort of grey coloured blobs so you can see them as long as the room's not too dark. They have various different functions, which I'll go through very shortly. There's then a joystick or a little directional button there. If you press any of the buttons or twiddle the joystick, or indeed press the joystick, then you get a little quick menu that shows you the functions for each button. The first two there, the first two with little blobs on, they're actually shortcut keys. So if you go into the OSD, to the main menu, by pressing the joystick now, clicking that in, you can see at the end here, shortcut keys, shortcut 1 and shortcut 2. I find it very strange that they've got 6 little main buttons with blobs on, but they only allow you to assign 2 of them to shortcut keys. That's very restrictive in my opinion. It's a bit weird as well, but that's what they've done. So you can set these to various different settings, such as a blue light filter. You can quickly adjust the brightness. ProArt Preset is grayed out simply because that's what my shortcut key 2 button is assigned to right now. PIP, P by P, color temp, volume, or you can have it quickly activate user mode 1 or user mode 2. So as for the ones you can't configure, which should really be, in my opinion, shortcut key 3, 4, 5 and 6, or maybe not 6 because that's actually a little exit button, that kind of makes sense, so that's not configurable, but the other ones anyway. The first one there is self-calibration. I'm not sure why this has a setting in the OSD, but if you're using the ASUS ProArt calibration software, it's controlled by the software. You don't need to do anything on the monitor specifically. There's then QuickFit Plus. Which I'll go through when I get into it in the main menu system. And there is Input, which allows you to quickly select the input used by the monitor. Onto the main menu. Various different ProArt presets. Now usually when I review monitors I will tell you that the presets are useless, or most of them are useless. You should just stick to the standard mode, make manual adjustments, but in this case they're all distinct, they all have a purpose, which is good. They're all actually very nicely configured in various different ways. So the standard mode, that's the factory defaults, that will use a full native gamut of the monitor, and you have plenty of flexibility here as well. You don't have anything grayed out, so you can access all of your stuff. Aspect control, that is grayed out, but that's because I'm running the native resolution, and that's relevant to non-native resolutions. I'll come on to that shortly. There is sRGB mode, that's an sRGB emulation setting. You'll notice you can't quickly cycle through the presets, so you have to activate each one individually, go through them even if you don't want to activate it, which I find a little bit annoying, to be honest. You should be able to just quickly cycle through them, but you can't. Anyway, sRGB mode, sRGB emulation, so that clamps the gamut close to sRGB. You can't adjust the brightness, saturation, hue, color temp, so a lot of this is grayed out, but not to worry. If you wanted sRGB emulation and you did want to change all of that, that's what the Rec 709 mode down there is for. I'll show you that shortly. Adobe RGB mode. This is an Adobe RGB emulation setting, clamps the gamut close to Adobe RGB, and you can see that you retain a lot of these controls. You can adjust the brightness, you can adjust the color as well, which means you can change the color channels manually, the saturation, hue, gain and offset, gain being the main control, red, green and blue. It's Rec 2020 mode. The monitor doesn't have a Rec 2020 gamut, so this uses the full native gamut, but it also gives you some oversaturation. Crushes shades together. That's kind of harder to say than I thought. Crushes shades together, particularly for the more saturated shades, so you do lose shade variety, and it looks kind of artificial and compressed and a bit weird. I don't like it, but I suppose it does have a purpose if you are working with Rec 2020 content, but be aware that you're not going to see it properly because you don't have a Rec 2020 gamut. DCI P3 mode, that is a DCI P3 emulation mode, as I'm sure you've guessed by this point. Full controls there. This has a few different color temperature settings, so P3 Theater is the default one. There's also 6500K, and although the default gamma is 2.6, you can change that to 2.2 if you prefer. And by the way, if any of these targets don't apply to you, for example, you wanted to, say, use DCI P3 with a gamma of 2.4, but you couldn't select that in the OSD. You can hardware calibrate this monitor using the ASUS ProArt calibration software. You can use the integrated colorimeter, or you can use your own colorimeter, an X-Rite or Calibrite or Spider device, or also a Klein device. I've got a separate video looking at this, and I'll link to that in the description of the video. But basically you can really set things up however you want, which is excellent flexibility to have. There's DICOM, so that follows the DICOM standard if that's something you use. It's not something I'm familiar with myself, but you can again see that you can adjust various things like the color channels, brightness, that kind of thing. The gamma is locked off here. Rec 709 mode, so we've finally got to that. So this is an sRGB emulation mode. It gives you an sRGB gamut, but gives you greater control in the OSD. You can really change everything except for P3 Theater, which is designed for the DCI P3 setting. All of the gamma settings, color channels, brightness, everything there. There are some settings which are only available in HDR, and I'll show you them very shortly. The next one is User Mode 1 and User Mode 2. By default, they're quite similar to the standard setting. You can hardware calibrate the monitor. Again, you can overwrite these presets using the ASUS ProArt calibration software. Again, there's a video exploring that. And in terms of the OSD flexibility with User Mode 1 and User Mode 2, most of this is available. You can change the color channels, the brightness. The gamma control is locked off and color temp is locked off. But again, if you're hardware calibrating the monitor, you can set this all up how you want. I've got the monitor running in HDR now. I've switched over HDR on Windows. And the main settings here are HDR PQ Rec 2020. That uses the full native gamut of the monitor. It follows the HDR 10 standard. There's HDR PQ DCI, which does the same, but it clamps the gamut to DCI P3. If you're creating content, then that might be useful. Generally, when you're consuming content, it really depends on your preferences in terms of saturation, but I find the Rec 2020 mode works well, even if the content you're consuming is actually designed with the DCI P3 color space in mind under HDR. But that's really a personal preference. That's just how things generally would look under HDR on monitors, but this one does give you more flexibility. Speaking of flexibility, you can also hardware calibrate the HDR settings of the monitor, or hardware calibrate it under HDR. So you can have the user mode assigned to different HDR profiles, or you can overwrite the other ones. You'll also see some are grayed out. That's because it needs to be receiving that particular HDR signal to use that. So there's HDR HLG BT2100. So that is hybrid log gamma. And there's another HLG hybrid log gamma setting with DCI, so that will clamp the gamut to the DCI P3 color space, but use the HLG standard. And there's HDR Dolby Vision, which will allow you to use Dolby Vision. So in terms of the settings you have available, when you have one of these selected, there are also a few other settings associated with it. By default, it's set to PQ optimized, and I like that. That works well in my opinion. But there's PQ clip, PQ basic. These are all explored in the HDR section of the review, so I'm not going to go through it all here. And you'll see here the brightness changes to max and 250 nits, again explored in the review. But if you want to set a different target for the brightness, you can also do that using hardware calibration again. But a lot of the menus grayed out, and that is very usual under HDR, but you can adjust the color channel. So if you just want to slightly rebalance things, you've got a bit of a tint going on or that kind of thing, you just want to change this a little bit, you can do that. There's also black level. This should really just be left at 50 for the most accurate representation of things. But if you need to darken things off, which will crush things together as well, or if you want to brighten things up, which can start making things look quite flooded, you can do that. But that's just really a control. It's quite useful if you're editing HDR content and you want to sort of be able to see certain areas of the image more clearly, perhaps. Also be aware that if you switch between SDR and HDR, or vice versa, then it should get you back to the SDR preset you were using before when you go back to SDR. So next you've got ProArt Palette. So these are the settings which I've really shown you most of these already. There's brightness, contrast, saturation. So if you increase this, it's a digital saturation boost, so it does crush things together, pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut, so you lose shade variety, but it increases the saturation of many shades as a result. Or you can decrease this if you want to decrease the saturation, and things will eventually go completely monochrome or completely grayscale. Next there's hue. So this is your hue adjustment. You can make things look completely wacky if you like, but of course if you're editing content, then this may be something you wish to do. Bias the hue one way or the other. Color temp. Again, I've shown you these, and depending on the preset, different options are available there. On my unit, 6500K did actually come very close to that when I recorded it, same with the 5000K. So yeah, these settings are actually quite useful in terms of coming close to the stated values, or certainly were on my unit, and I expect that sort of level of calibration with other units as well. The 5000K setting is actually a low blue light setting because it gives a very warm look to the image, a weak blue color channel, and it doesn't give you a green push or green tint either. So this is a nice low blue light setting, a well balanced one, which I actually quite like using myself in the evenings. You've then got your gamma control. You can set this to various different settings there, and if you want finer control, for example, you wanted 2.1 gamma or something like that, again, you can hardware calibrate the monitor as you wish in that respect. There's then color, 6-axis hue, so you get finer control over the hue adjustments. You can do it with each red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow channel. You have the same channel adjustments but with saturation instead, so this gives you finer control over saturation. What I would say though is that try and stick to the different emulation modes if you can. It'll give you more accurate results within a given color space. If you adjust these, then you'll find that some shades tend to become undersaturated and other ones remain oversaturated. But if you do need a little bit of control here, then it certainly gives you that. Red, green and blue gain, that's your main RGB channel adjustments, which you'll find on many monitors. Offset, again, red, green and blue, but these sort of skew the gamma curve for red, green and blue channels. So again, if you want to tweak this, you can. Most users shouldn't need to do this, and if you're making major adjustments here, it's really going to make your gamma quite wonky. But to be honest, if you need to use offset controls, you're probably aware of what they do and you can access them here. Black level, which I went through under HDR, you can also use this under SDR if you wish. I've just quickly brought up lagom.nl, the black levels test, so you can see what this does more clearly. Just be aware that what you see on the video does not represent what you'll see by eye, but it will give you a rough idea of what this does. So you can see that the visibility is increased, those shades are lifted up if you increase the black level, but the black background also lifts up. So 50 and below gives you true black, so actual black. But if you reduce this below 50, then you start crushing the shades together. If you increase it above that, then it does lift things up, but it also lifts your black depth up, so you do lose contrast as well. There's color reset, which will reset these particular settings to the factory defaults. You've then got some image settings. I'm just going to close Lagom, I don't need that open anymore. So you've got sharpness control, 0 is the default. If you want to sharpen things up or have sort of excessive sharpness, extra sharpness, then you can do that in increments of 10 here. Aspect control, that's grayed out unless you're running a non-native resolution. So I'm just going to quickly switch over to a non-native resolution. So I'm running 2560 by 1440, 1440p WQHD resolution. You see there are different settings here, full 4:3, 1:1 and overscan. Overscan and 4:3, that depends on the system you're using and the resolution you're using. So that's not applicable in this case because it's a 16:9 resolution anyway, so you don't have those options. But if you want to use one-to-one pixel mapping, you can do that. So it will only use the pixels called for by the source resolution and will give you a black border around the image for the rest. And as you can probably guess, full uses all of the pixels. Next, you've got input range. Generally just leave that set to auto, which is the default setting. But if you need to enforce a particular signal, so full or limited range 16 to 235 or 16 to 254, you can do that here. Blue light filter, that's a low blue light setting and has an increasing effect as you increase the number further. Level 4 has the brightness locked to a low level as well, whereas with the others you can adjust the brightness according to your preferences. They are effective, particularly level 3 and level 4, but they also impart a green tint because the green channel is left rather strong. I would instead recommend, if you prefer a more balanced look to the image, just setting the color temperature to 5000K. That's a nice alternative low blue light setting. Next, you've got the self-calibration section. That's grayed out unless you're actually using the integrated colorimeter using the ASUS ProArt calibration software. Really, you can just use the software to control that. I'm not really sure why you need to go into the OSD and do anything there. Next, you've got PIP, P-by-P, picture-in-picture, picture-by-picture. This monitor supports 4-system picture-by-picture. So lots of flexibility here. You can have 4 different systems connected. Really quite boring at the moment because I've only got one system connected. You can see black space for the others, but it would be able to have, for example, DisplayPort, HDMI and USB-C all displayed at the same time. There's also PIP, picture in picture, so you can have that set to right top, right bottom or left bottom. A few associated settings with this as well. You can control how the sources are displayed, which source is used for which section of the screen, so you can reconfigure all of that. Main source, sub-source of using P by P, you can select which is on the top left, top right, bottom left and bottom right. Color setting, so this allows you to have different presets assigned to different sources. And you can change the size of the PIP box, so I was showing you middle or medium before, that's the large box. And that's the small box. Next you've got QuickFit Plus, so there's a safe area. This gives you little guidelines on the screen for your workspace. That setting's called Action Safe. I don't know how these are named and I don't really use this myself, so I'm not entirely sure. There's one-to-one. Title Safe. And apologies about the position of the camera, it means you can't see, but it also has a little section at the top and bottom locked off as well. And then this good old 3x3 grid. At least I know what that is. There's then center marker. 3 different types here. It gives you a little cross, a black cross in the middle of the screen. It's unfortunate background, you can't quite see that clearly because of the background. There you go, it's a bit better now. You could also use this as a giant crosshair in a game, if you so desire. There's type 2. And then there is type 3, which goes across the entire screen and basically splits it into 4 sections. There's also customization, which lets you have a square, a custom size on the screen. You can change it horizontally and vertically. So you can have it various different sizes. It doesn't have to be a square, it could be a rectangle, depending on how you set this up. And last but not least for this section, there is a ruler, which gives you a little measurement guide on the screen in centimeters. There's also a vertical scale there, again centimeters. So it appears to go up to 70 horizontally and around 40 vertically. And if you want to get rid of any of these little overlays, by the way, you press the X button, which is sort of the last blob button there, the one with the little red X there. That will get rid of them. Next you've got input select, so you can select the input used by the monitor. You've then got HDR preview. What this will do is, if this is set to on, which I believe it is by default, then it will just show your HDR settings if you're in SDR as well, but the image is completely messed up. There's nothing HDR about the image, so I really don't see the point in doing this, but if for whatever reason you need to or want to, you can do that. Really just gives you a weird hybrid SDR HDR, which is just odd and doesn't look right. Dolby Vision, that's not available on my pre-release sample, and it won't be available, I believe, on very early samples of this monitor, but it will be a firmware update option, which will mean it's user upgradable, but also newer samples will just have it automatically enabled, that functionality anyway. Uniform brightness, this is explored in the review. Set this to on or off. Most people want to leave this on because it stops the screen's brightness changing according to the average picture level or how much brightness is displayed versus darkness on the screen. So it gives you more consistency, very useful on the desktop in particular. USB setup, so you can set this to USB 2 or USB 3.2, depending on your preferences. As you can see, if you want to use the full resolution, you have to have USB 2, so it will use more of the signal for the display and less for the data transfer. That's basically why that has a different setting there. And it does say there that it will just interrupt your power delivery function. This is just temporary. It doesn't mean it will disrupt it forever or anything like that. It's just for a short period of time whilst it switches over the USB operating mode. Next up, you've got power saving, normal level or deep level. This is basically just allowing the monitor to enter deep sleep. If you're finding that it's not waking properly with the system, then you might want to set this to normal level, but deep level will mean that when the monitor's on standby, it will use a little bit less power, but either way, it's not going to use a lot of power. OSD setup. So you can change the OSD timeout, so that's how long after the last button press before the OSD will automatically disappear, or of course you can just press the exit button if you want to get rid of it quickly. And you can set that between 10 seconds and 2 minutes. DDC/CI, part of the plug and play functionality of the monitor, allows you to access the OSD using software, for example. As far as I'm aware, or as far as I could see, ASUS doesn't have any specific software for controlling the OSD of this monitor, but of course they do have the ASUS ProArt calibration software, which allows you to hardware calibrate things, which is very useful. It's transparency. You can change the transparency level of the OSD, various different levels here. I find the default of 20 perfectly fine. Auto rotation, that will mean that when you pivot the monitor, when you're using the main stand, because I've got it using the little mini stand at the moment, so this isn't relevant, but if using the main stand and the monitor detects that it's in portrait, or indeed if you've got it mounted another way where you can have it in portrait orientation, it will automatically rotate the menu system for you as well. You can change the language that the OSD is displayed in, various different options here. I sometimes find that people have it in a different language, but they don't know how to change the language, so be aware that it's in System Setup, and it's just sort of at the bottom of the first page there. Sound, you can change the volume of anything connected to the 3.5mm jack or the integrated speakers if you're unfortunate enough to be using them. I say that because they're not actually very good, which is a bit of a shame for such an expensive monitor, but they're really not something which most people are going to want to use anyway, and they are just there for basic sound output if you need to use them. I'll explore that a little bit more in the written review in the features and aesthetics section, where you can mute that and change the source for the sound. That's if you've got PIP or P/P enabled. DisplayPort streams, you can change the DisplayPort version between 1.4 or 1.1 for compatibility purposes. Screen sync, I never come across this feature before, to be honest, and this monitor doesn't currently have a user manual available, so I'm not entirely sure what that does. There's key lock. So if you enable this, it says there, keys locked. Check quick start guide to cancel this function. As I've just said, there isn't a manual or quick start guide available for this monitor yet. So I'm just going to spend the next 20 minutes of this video trying to work out how to unlock the keys. There we go. So all I did there is I held the last main button, so the one next to the joystick, the last little blob button, for around 10 seconds, and then it unlocked everything. Next, you've got power indicator if you want to disable the power LED. Next, you've got ambient effect. Clever idea, because this uses the colorimeter when it's at its rest position as a light sensor, and it allows you to adjust the brightness of the screen. That's light effect, according to the, or it'll adjust the brightness of the screen, I should say, according to the ambient brightness of the room. You'll see it locks off your brightness control, so you have no say over what it's doing. Everyone has their own preferences for brightness, so this is far too restrictive. I really think this is a sad waste of the feature, and with a monitor this expensive, I really would have expected to see a better light sensor feature if they're going to be including that. But you might happen to find the adjustments agreeable, in which case that's fine, you can use it. And there's also, I'm just going to disable light effect. You can have them both active at the same time if you want, but there's adaptive color. That will use the sensor to adjust the color temperature according to ambient lighting. I don't know if you saw that, but as soon as I exited the menu, things have gone really green. There's a strong green tint. I think it looks a bit warmer as well, the image, but the green tint is sort of overwhelmingly strong. Next, you've got proximity sensor. So this will dim the screen by various different levels at various different stages. I talk about this in the image retention section of the written review. It is designed to reduce burn-in risk or image retention risk as well. With this being an OLED screen, that's something you want to be a bit careful with. I have to say I didn't have any issues during my review period, but I only used this monitor for about 3 weeks, so that doesn't really give you a very good idea longer term. If you're finding the proximity sensor not working for you, it's not dimming the screen, and it does it for various levels, so after a few minutes I believe it dims it a bit, and then a few more minutes it'll dim it even more. If you're finding it's not working properly, leave that off and use screen protection instead. I actually prefer this. Also, the proximity sensor's worth bearing in mind. If you're using the mini stand as I am at the moment, then it's likely that the sensor is going to be too low down, and it's going to actually just sort of look at your desk rather than you, and therefore it'll work unreliably if you've got this stand. If you're using the main stand and you've got that set to a low position, then you might find the proximity center doesn't work properly either. So you'd want to use the screen protection feature instead. This looks at the signal, and if there's little or no change, so if, for example, the clock's changing, that's fine. But if you're basically not using the monitor, and then it will dim the screen based on that. Again, it does it progressively, so it dims it a bit after, I think, a minute, a bit more after perhaps 5 minutes, and a bit more after 10 minutes. Next, you've got information, which gives you some information about the screen, as you might expect. Various different things there. And that's really all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ASUS PA32DC. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, great way of supporting us as well.